thank you all for coming today to celebrate Lou Marinoff and discuss the publication of his latest work, Essays on Philosophy, Praxis and Culture, an eclectic, provocative, and prescient collection just published about a month ago by Anthem Press. I'm Rick Rapetti. I'm a philosopher, a philosophical counselor, and a colleague of Lou's in two institutions, the City University of New York, or CUNY, where we both teach, albeit on different campuses, he in Manhattan and I in Brooklyn, and also the American Philosophical Practitioners Association, APPA, where he's the founder and president, and I'm one of 4 VPs. I was invited here to introduce this work for a different reason, and that's that I had the honor of writing the introduction to this incredibly rich, provocative collection of essays, as the title aptly suggests. Thus, I want to thank my colleague, mentor, and friend, Lou Marinoff, for inviting me here to speak about his collection of powerfully prescient essays. Since many of you knew Lou long before I met him, many of you probably know him much better than I do. So I won't say much more to introduce him, but I will say a little for the few of you who may be new to Lou and his work. Thus, my focus will be to introduce this book, but I'll also say a little bit about myself and my relationship with Lou's work. So for any newcomers, Lou Marinoff is many great things, but first and foremost, he is my professional philosophical friend, mentor, and role model, someone I look up to for many reasons. I think he's a true Renaissance man, a master of many trades, too many to list here, but someone with extensive knowledge of a broad variety of areas of knowledge, making him a true lover of wisdom, a philosopher in the original sense, of one for whom philosophy is a way of life, the so-called via contemplativa. Professor Marinoff not only helped to spearhead the philosophical counseling movement in the United States and abroad, with such best-selling and groundbreaking books as Plato, Not Prozac, and Therapy for the Sane, among many others translated into dozens of languages, but he has also worked tirelessly in founding and directing the American Philosophical Practitioners Association, APPA, or APA, which has trained and certified hundreds of philosophical counselors around the world, as well as helped in the development of philosophical counseling programs around the globe, most recently, the Philosophical Practitioners Association of India, or PPAI. I first found out about Lou's work when a colleague recommended Plato, Not Prozac. After reading it, I was hooked. I soon joined the APPA, started attending their meetings, and signed up for and completed the APA certification program for philosophical counselors. Since then, I've developed a substantial philosophical counseling practice with many clients from all over the world, in such places as Denmark, Japan, Taiwan, Australia, and recently Uganda, not to mention several states in the US, all of which I credit to my training at APA and Lou's guidance. Soon thereafter, Lou invited me to start making presentations at APA's annual meetings and in APA's certification program, which invitations I heartily accepted. Last year, Lou and his co-directors invited me to serve on APA's board of directors, to the position of vice president, alongside APA's other newly appointed VP, the renowned and highly respected philosophical counseling figure, Lydia Amir. Lou's spirit of goodwill, reflected in the Nichiren Buddhist or Soka Gakkai imperative to increase value, is infectious. Much more can be said to praise Lou, but my introduction to his latest book, to which our presence here today is dedicated, may be construed as a hymn to his many virtuous qualities. So I must refrain from repeating much of my praise here, as I don't want to be redundant. For those of you who may have already read my introduction to his collection of essays on the one hand, nor to say so much about his many virtues that potential readers will think they don't need to read my introduction on the other hand. For whereas Lou's entire collection of essays is a must-read, as far as I'm concerned, I'm confident that if anyone is not already keen to that fact, then my introduction to them will certainly change your mind and persuade you to go ahead and read them all, if for no other reason than the fact that my introduction was written precisely as a guide to each essay, spelling out in concise terms exactly what Lou sets out to achieve in each essay. Kind of summary. Thus, if you're not already dead set on reading this book, I guarantee that my introduction will change your mind. I also know that when I hand the mic over to Lou, he plans to spend about a minute each for each essay describing his own take on each of them. So for all these reasons, I will not repeat much of what is there. Instead, I'll focus on some other important things to consider about Lou and his latest work. This incredibly rich collection of essays, spanning approximately 3 decades of Lou's thought as socio-cultural critic, reflects this philosophical prophet's clarion call to philosophical action. What's amazing about it is the extent to which Marinoff's previously published, dated essays predict the socio-cultural trends that have already come to fruition, revealing the validity of his virtually precognitive prophetic visions in multiple domains. Lou's sometimes scathing critiques of, for example, the cartel formed by big pharmaceutical companies, the American Psychiatric Association, APA, its Bible, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, or DSM, and medical insurance companies, their collusion to diagnose millions of children with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and drug millions of children in their formative years in school, and the medicalization and drugging of millions of adults for otherwise philosophical issues such as existential anxiety, among other cutting exposés of all those who would oppose philosophical counseling, constitutes an undeniably urgent call to philosophical action for those of us who care about the state of society and of our profession as philosophical gadflies and midwives. Given the comprehensive nature of Marinoff's insights about our present predicament and its trajectory in this prophetic collection, anyone who wishes to get closer to the truth in this age of misinformation would be wise to read this collection very conscientiously. To use Plato's metaphor of the cave of ignorance, Marinoff succinctly, dramatically, and prophetically diagnoses the many different shadows in the contemporary cave, the beliefs the prisoners have formed about them, and the nature of the chains binding the prisoners to their delusional shadow worlds. Marinoff here is embodying the Socratic sage, returning to the cave, preaching to the prisoners about the way the shadows are cast and the world of real objects outside the cave and the sun that illuminates them. If anyone's wisdom can free them, it's Marinoff's, and thus any philosophical practitioner who would take on the same sagacious, soteriological role of philosophical activist would benefit greatly from the incredible wealth of philosophical missionary tools to be found in these pages. To me, while it is technically a collection of individual or standalone essays, given the impact of Marinoff's latest book on me, it may have been better entitled A Manual for Creating Socratic Activists. For anyone who reads it is likely to have no choice but to take up the sword of discriminative wisdom and speak out against the increasingly rampant, mind-numbing ignorance that's spreading like a cancer across contemporary culture in this age of misinformation on both sides of the political spectrum, fake news, propaganda disguised as journalism, censorship, political correctness, and cancel culture, among other modern ills. If you haven't read this book yet, I strongly urge you to do so. And again, if you need a more detailed argument why, then you must read my introduction, which serves as a fairly comprehensive guide to the highlights of each essay. I must confess that even in this, I'm no match for Marinoff, for his own preface to this collection is even more concise, powerful, and persuasive than even my own introduction, particularly insofar as it places each essay in biographical relief, explaining each in the context of a life worth biographing, but which life is as of yet unfinished, I can assure you, as in my role of APPA VP, I am privy to many of Lou's incredibly aspirational visions for APPA and its mission to help enlighten society and bring philosophy to the people. If you have not read the essays or my intro, then I can assure you that you must at least read his preface, at which point you will not be able to put the book down. In a few moments, Lou will give his own, even more concise abstracts of each chapter, which I am confident will play the same role in capturing your interests. In closing, however, I'll mention one more idea that I think places Lou's work in great relief, and that is that an Indian sage of the 19th century that's inspired me, Sri Ramakrishna, one of the patriarchs of modern Indian Advaita Vedanta or non-dualistic philosophy, once remarked that in this dark age of deception and delusion, truthfulness is the primary form of spiritual discipline. Lou's life work, his curriculum vitae in the highest sense of that term, is a form of philia aletheia, or love of truth, truth spoken in the critical prophetic voice, as a form of philosophical action, speaking truth to power with tremendous love of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Merely speaking the truth in this age of misinformation, political correctness, and cancel culture is a revolutionary philosophical act. Whether you agree or disagree with any of Lou's own particular premises or conclusions. Lou's latest work is a tribute to Philia Aletheia, to the love of truth, and thus more broadly to Philia Sophia, the love of wisdom, Philosophia. I am both honored and happy to hand the mic over now to Professor Lou Marinoff. Thank you. Let's all give a warm welcome to Professor Lou Marinoff.
Thank you so much, Rick. Basically, thank you so much for that I think, complimentary introduction. I am reminded of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who had interesting dinner parties in Concord, Massachusetts during the New England Transcendentalists times. And he once told about a politician he had invited to dinner during an election cycle. And after dinner, the politician kind of commandeered the audience and got up on his hind legs to speechify and began unstintingly to praise his own virtues. And Emerson remarked that the louder he sang of his virtues, the faster we counted our spoons. So that's a cautionary tale. What I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to share with you a few backstories, as well as a kind of Cook's tour of some of these essays for those of you who are unacquainted with them, and that's the majority. So I'll spend, as Rick said, just a minute or so on each essay explaining what it's about, but also we'll give you a little bit of the backstory behind the essay in terms of the ethos that gave rise to it in each case. And this was at the suggestion of Professor Bala, who's a great instigator in all positive ways. And having reviewed the collection, he asked me out of curiosity about some of what was going on in the background while these things were written over, mind you, a quarter century. So I'm going to endeavor to shed some light on that as well. All right, so please bear with me while I share the screen. So the book is really divided into 4 parts, and each part, the essays are published here in the book almost in the same chronological order in which they appeared in all kinds of far-flung collections, anthologies, and journals. So it is also a kind of a history of the emergence of things. And part 1 has the common denominator of case studies. There are 16 essays in the collection, and there are therefore 4 parts with 4 essays in each. It's very nicely symmetric as it happens. So let me now go through a little bit with you about part 1, dealing with different kinds of case studies. The first essay in the book on the emergence of ethical counseling actually marks my entry into the field way back when at University of British Columbia, where I spent 3 wonderful years, 1991 to 1994, before relocating to City College. And there at UBC Center for Applied Ethics, I actually encountered my first 2 cases. One was a phone call, the other one was a walk-in, and those are described in the essay. Also, we tried to establish some protocols for handling these kinds of cases, and we made ourselves available to the public, pro bono publica, and developed some ways of handling these kinds of issues with our clients. We also, in the process, encountered other people around the world who were doing this. And so I was at the same time becoming acquainted with Ron Lahav and the broader philosophical counseling community. And we ended up co-organizing the first international conference on philosophical practice, which took place at UBC in July of 1994. There are the pictures. Vana is there on the right, and Lydia next to her, and Ida Jongsma, Ora Gruengard, who's been to every single one along with Lydia since. I think that's Anders Linzeth and some of the other key players in the movement. This continued, and the first ICPP has now morphed into 16 different ICPPs conducted all over the world by able organizers. We have Sasha in the room, at least, who ran a wonderful conference in 2014 in Belgrade. And there are other organizers who may or may not be able to join us today. But this is the movement as it stands. And I would urge those of you interested in the history, the chronology, and the content of the movement to go to this website, icpp.site, where you will find details on each and every conference, including the programs, background of the organizers, and a lot of other information about the development of the movement. We are absolutely without political structure and without ideology. Our purpose is to share insights, experiences, and initiatives on all aspects of philosophical practice. The website is a history and chronology. And at each ICPP, the community who happens to come to it votes on the location of the next ICPP based on proposals by those who wish to organize it. It is entirely democratic and entirely apolitical, and may it ever remain that way. The next one will be in Romania in 2023. So on to Essay 2, What Philosophical Counseling Can't Do. And this is now basically a reflection of the development of my practice at City College. And one of the things that philosophical counseling can't do is help people who are determined to sabotage their own progress. And the bulk of this case is about an extraordinary client who was above all else skilled at defeating every attempt that anyone made to help her or encourage her to help herself. She was suing everybody under the sun, including her family, social services, New York State, the water company, the power company, every psychotherapist she ever had. Why did I take her on? Well, I guess in those days I was less risk averse, and she was referred to me by her cardiologist. She was actually seeking and needed psychiatric care, but she was 6 weeks out from her appointment and needed to talk to somebody. So I talked with her, and she actually was very brilliant. She had cooked up an idea to obtain or to seek medical asylum in Canada, which was a fantastic and radical idea. And she could have gotten publicity for it and therefore an advance on a book about the US healthcare system, something she knew a lot about. But every attempt to help her do that also failed. And eventually, when I asked her whether she was prepared to assume any responsibility for anything she had done in her life, she fired me, which was a great relief. But a very interesting case, and certainly one that as philosophical counselors we're ill-equipped to handle. Essay 3 deals with the case of attempting to apply John Stuart Mill's harm principle, as elucidated in his very famous essay on liberty, to cyberspace. And as Rick remarked in his introduction, it surprised him that back in around 2000, when this was published, I had predicted the lowering of cyber curtains and the curation and censorship of data by media platforms that did not yet exist. But I was able to understand what cyberspace was in its emergent years, at least to the extent that it was going to be colonized by tech oligarchs and governments who would then lower various kinds of cyber curtains on us and also use the medium to propagandize us and to provide misinformation and other forms of as what Rick alluded to as being screens in Plato's cave. So that unfortunately has come to pass. And I'll say no more about it here. But I do remember, Moshe, you have to take some credit because I wrote much of this essay at your kitchen table back in the late 90s as I returned frequently to Vancouver to visit my dear friends there. I remember drinking coffee and sitting at your place with my computer and working on this essay. Essay 4 in this first section of the book is a lot more contentious. And it deals with equal opportunity versus employment equity. It was originally an invited paper at a conference at Wilfrid Laurier University on business and professional ethics. And basically, I called attention to the Canadian Philosophical Association and its manifesto published in 1993, which essentially sought to exclude by policy all white males from applying for university positions in philosophy departments on the grounds that there were too many of us, and that's the wording of the manifesto, too many white males in Canadian philosophical departments, and that's basically is a situation which they sought to rectify by means of quota systems and other kinds of political measures. This was all justified by these two, and particularly the second of two clauses in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that was part of the patriation of the Constitution from Britain that took place under the government of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the father of the current Prime Minister. And you will note that that 15.1 is a wonderful statement of equality. Every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination. This is fantastic. And in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or how bravo, for an enlightened statement on equality under the law. However, all of that is undone in a trice in section 15.2, which does not preclude any law program or activity that has as its object the amelioration of conditions of disadvantaged individuals or groups. This is basically the thin edge of the wedge of group rights. And this is something that I stridently have opposed for 30 years and more. I believe strongly and endorse individual rights as elucidated in 15.1, but not group rights. This was basically an Orwellian kind of a schema where, if you just reread Animal Farm, 15.1 says that all animals are equal, but 15.2 says that some animals are more equal than others. And having legislated this, they swiftly acquired the livestock. So I wrote a paper basically objecting to all of this, and it used the Canadian Philosophical Association as a case study and gave the paper at a conference. The paper was then canceled. It was edited out of the volume of proceedings. The editor accepted it, but the editorial board of the university that published the proceedings basically censored the paper. It was subsequently published in the US in this journal, Sexuality and Culture, and you can read it for yourselves. In this anthology. The sort of takeaways I just will share with you at the end of each of these parts, the main takeaways that are not part of the anthology of essays, but were things that were happening at the same time. I gave a farewell gift to Canada in 1994 called Fair New World, reverting to my nom de plume. The Taflers are quite an interesting family. That's my mother's maiden name. And so I proudly put that on my politically most incorrect works. I'm the sort of enfant terrible of the Tafler family. So it comes from there. This is a ruthless and savage satire on political correctness and radical feminism. And in fact, if you read it, you'll find that it predicts a lot of what's already happened in cancel culture, et cetera. But in fact, they haven't even gone that far yet. I'm still a little bit ahead of them, although it was published almost 30 years ago. They still haven't quite caught up to it. I extrapolated what's going on to its most logically ridiculous and absurd conclusion. And you can read about two dystopias, Feminania and Brutland, the backlash male state, and my idea of a utopia called Melior, which only means better, because that's about as well as we can do on a given day. Nothing in this world will be perfect, but we can always do better rather than worse. Please have a look at it if you are so moved. This is the 25th anniversary edition, which was published in 2019 and introduced by Daphne Patoy, Professor Emerita at Tufts, and the author of a wonderful essay on wanting to be a human being in a department that had been completely politicized. And she's a romantic literature professor. And the foreword by Hardy Orbs, a wonderful Canadian philosopher, aka Andrew Irvin, my friend and colleague also from UBC. And of course, 5 years later, now in New York, some very smart people got hold of me, and in collaboration with HarperCollins, we brought out Plato, Not Prozac, in 1999. This very quickly went around the world, as some of you know, into 27 languages and became a bestseller in dozens of countries and opened doors for me which had hitherto been closed. So that leads to part two, which are global essays and the fallout really from travels around the world and the great opportunity to meet with many world leaders, peace Nobel laureates, scientific Nobel laureates, heads of state, entrepreneurs, Fortune 500 CEOs, and others in this philosophy world tour that began on the heels of the publication of Plato, Not Prozac. So part two is, however, conditioned very strongly by 9/11, which I witnessed from my rooftop in Jersey City. At the time, I had gone through the World Trade Center the night before, late that night before, on September 10th, not knowing, of course, that it would be for the last time. And most of these essays, one way or another, are also therefore reflecting this path that the world was taken down on that day. It made a sharp turn down a road which few had foreseen and which mandated all kinds of developments, not all of which were happy. So as it happened, I had been invited previously to deliver the Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture in 2001. That was in November of 2001 by the General Semantic Institute, the Institute for General Semantics, which celebrates Korzybski's work. And it was a great honor to deliver that lecture at the Yale Club, but it was also very timely because Alfred Korzybski, in his books, Science and Sanity, Manhood of Humanity, and his other works, is able to explain a lot to us about human nature, about how it is we elect leaders or how leaders themselves take over and the kinds of damage that they are likely to do to themselves and to societies. So Korzybski has great relevance, and his theory of general semantic is widely applicable to philosophical practice in the global village. This is an important essay, and it was delivered in a timely fashion, although it was an unfortunate and difficult time. This essay 6, which is the second essay in part 2, deals with a really interesting situation that came up with some psychiatrists, both in the US and abroad, again on the heels of the publication of Plato, Not Prozac, and also the textbook Philosophical Practice in 2001. American psychiatrists were very quick to defend their turf. And the then president of the American Psychiatric Association accused me in print on a front page article in the LA Times of practicing medicine without a license because I was delivering ethics counseling to people. And I replied that if he thought that moral dilemmas were mental illnesses, then he was practicing non-medicine with a license, and that he himself should be the first to be receiving philosophical counseling. So that's the kind of brouhaha that the American press loves to stir up. So they did us a great service, but they also provoked the ire of psychologists and psychiatrists by promoting philosophical counseling as a more broad spectrum kind of approach than we ourselves had ever intended it to be. And so a very interesting guy, a psychiatrist and professor from Tufts named Ronald Pies, maybe David, you know him, but in any case, Ronald wrote a really interesting letter to the psychiatric newsletter comparing me to Ludovico Settembrini, which is the main character in Thomas Mann's work, The Magic Mountain, in which Settembrini is attempting to diagnose the ills of his civilization at that time. And, you know, Thomas Mann was a great, great writer, Nobel laureate, and prophet of the decline of Western civilization. As it happens, this book, The Magic Mountain, this great novel of Mann's, which features Settembrini, is set in Davos, which when Mann was writing was a sanatorium, a small ski resort and a village in the Alps, but also a sanatorium for wealthy people with respiratory illnesses. And as it happens, I ended up in Davos very shortly after this article was published by Ron Pies. And so I actually took on the role of Settembrini. And the closing luncheon at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in Davos is held on the parapets of the Schatzalp Hotel on top of the mountain. And that is where Thomas Mann himself was staying when he wrote this novel. So I became unwittingly a kind of reincarnation of Settembrini. I ended up answering Ronald Pies and other charges made made in this essay, which I think is quite significant. And it was well received by Ron Pies himself. We became friends after I replied to him in a rational way. And he actually incorporated a couple of my case studies in his wonderful book, Using Stoicism in His Psychiatric Practice. That of course, from Epictetus, everything has two handles. So Thomas Schramm, a philosopher of science in Germany, and Johannes Thome, who did his medical work at Yale and is in charge, or was in charge, of the psychiatric program in Rostock, subsequently published this book and invited this essay. Thomas and Johannes are very interesting characters, and Johannes in particular thought back then that philosophers ought to be going into psychiatric institutions also and talking with patients. Fortunately, I didn't speak German and still don't, so I was off that hook. I got into enough trouble already, but I know that Vana, who's in the room today, has done some philosophical interventions with psychiatric patients, and so I think there is a lot of space for that to happen. Essay 7, I won't spend much time with this. It's part of it was bundled originally with More Matrix and Philosophy, edited by William Irvin. Some of you know him well. William has published an enormous number of books using philosophy in everyday life. He's done philosophy in The Simpsons. He's done philosophy in just about everything under the sun in popular culture, and has invited contributions, non-scholarly contributions, written about the applications of philosophy to various kinds of appurtenances of popular culture. He's done a great job with that. So I contributed to The Matrix and Plato's Cave, Why the Sequels Failed. Those of you who teach philosophy at an introductory level, as I do, will know that The Matrix is a tremendous way to introduce both Plato's Cave and also Descartes' question in Meditation 1 about how do I know the difference between being asleep and being awake? How can we really tell whether we're dreaming? How do we know what's real? And of course, students have all seen The Matrix, so they can relate very readily to Plato and to Descartes on that basis. The sequels failed simply because they were worse and worse copies of the original. And we can go to Plato's theory of mimesis for that. Okay. And the last essay in that part is on a very different tack. It deals with a serious topic, ethics, hunger, and globalization. This book was put out by some Davos class economists, Per Pinstrup Anderson at Cornell, and Peter Sando and other economists who were really concerned with appropriate food policies. We have the technology to feed everybody, but we don't have the political will to feed everybody, is what it boils down to. And they were looking for a philosopher to offer a kind of meta-ethical normative appraisal of the problem, which I did. And the short answer, or one way of approaching the short answer to this, what's the difference between human societies and animal societies, is to look at the Lotka-Volterra equations that describe almost all predator-prey relations. They're sinusoidal, and they are mutually dependent. So as prey increases, predators increase. When they overeat or overconsume, they reduce the available prey and therefore reduce their numbers. You can see that quite clearly. Whereas with humans, because of synthetic selection and synthetic resources, we behave differently. We have attained such huge numbers now that we're able to reduce our natural resources through overconsumption. And as population rises and certain aspects of nature are reduced, we are obliged to produce things synthetically, whether it's farmed food or farmed fish or whatever else is being manufactured. And this will result in a developmental divide into which many underdeveloped societies fall, and hence there are uneven distributions. Globalization has lifted, yes, millions, dare I say hundreds of millions out of poverty, but it has also created quasi-Hobbesian states of nature among underdeveloped peoples competing for that kind of help. So that's an analysis of the problem, which doesn't really have a solution beyond population control and political will. The takeaways from part 2 are many and varied. I just want to share with you that because of these global travels and this period, I think I was flying 100,000 miles a year all over the place, doing events, again, with world leaders, bookstore events, university lectures, all kinds of things, met amazing people and learned so much about how the global village operates and also fails to on a given day, that I felt motivated finally to write The Middle Way, which was published in 2007. Some of you are well acquainted with that book. But some of the outstanding people whom I was privileged and fortunate to meet during this period were, on top left, President Daisaku Ikeda of Soka Gakkai International, an amazing man, about whom a bit more later. That's our first meeting in Tokyo. I also had an opportunity to be introduced to Laura Huxley. Below, you will see Laura Huxley with Aldous Huxley, who was my childhood hero. He and George Orwell were genuine childhood heroes of mine. And it was an absolute thrill and an honor to be introduced to Laura and actually to become close to her. Met her several times. She was still living in the same house in the Hollywood Hills under the H, the same house where Aldous died, on mescaline, writing The Doors of Perception. And here she is in her 90s, spry and vigorous and in full possession of her faculties, a wonderful lady, a great lady. And we endorsed each other's books at the time and had a wonderful friendship. She is, some of you may know, his second wife. She comes from Italy originally. Laura is a violinist, became a psychotherapist and a writer and wife to Aldous. And Elie Wiesel, the late, great Elie Wiesel, and I met in Davos and had breakfast every year for a number of years in Davos and discussed the plight of world Jewry and how best to rectify some of the many problems that world Jewry was facing. Elie is a great soul, as these others are, and I learned a lot from him, believe me. So those were some of the takeaways of part two. At the same time, you should know, and it's in the preface, that City College did me a huge favor during this time by shutting down my work in philosophical practice completely. So sort of analogously to not being able to work in Canada and having to come to the United States, which was far from a punishment. It was the greatest opportunity of my life coming to New York. So again, thanks to those who closed the door in Canada to Commonwealth scholars. They were opened here. But then when psychologists gaslighted the administration at CUNY into believing that philosophical counseling was dangerous and should be prevented at all costs, and they illegally shut down an IRB research protocol and other initiatives. So again, closing the door in New York opened the door on the world. And that, my friends, is the takeaway, okay? When one door slams in your face, usually there's another one open, but you need to find it. Part three are maieutic essays, and those of you who may not be familiar with the term should know that a maieutic process is one in which, in a Socratic way, we endeavor to shine a light on latent ideas that are buried or swimming deeper in the mind and need to be brought closer to the surface in order to be apprehended. So this process is often also cathartic, but it's also a process that leads to great progress when successful. And these essays are therefore of the maieutic, all of them of the maieutic variety, written during this period, 2009 to 15. The first of them is probably one of the most well-known in the collection since it's been translated into a number of languages, including Chinese. It's called Synchronicity, Serpents, and Something Elseness, a meta-dialogue on philosophy and psychotherapy. It drew me into a relationship with Irvin Yalom, among other things. It started when a psychotherapist, a clinical psychologist, came to me for advice as a client on how to handle a patient who had ophidiophobia, which is fear of snakes. Many people have. And of course, phobias are not best handled by psychotherapy. And Irvin Yalom, of course, would endorse that position. Phobias are irrational fears. And the person with a phobia knows that they have a phobia. And so generally, the best way to handle phobics are through desensitization. That's behavioral therapy. That works very well in the main. And hypnotherapy can also work well. Psychotherapy is not well indicated for phobias, however. So I spent some time counseling this clinical psychologist about her patient who not only had ophidiophobia, but claimed he was manifesting snakes. And therefore trying to confront the object of his fears. A very interesting case in and of itself. But I went through a number of synchronistic episodes at the same time, including synchronicities with Yalom, which ended up being written up as one piece. And when discussing this case with Yalom, I remember we were in San Francisco having coffee in North Beach one morning, and I said to him, Irv, I had a feeling that this psychologist had something else on her mind as well, but we didn't ever get around to discussing it. And Irv commended me. He said, good instinct, Lou. He said, there is always something else. And I took this to be the first law of psychotherapy. There is always something else. This is why it goes on and on without end. And this is why the modern day Sisyphus is condemned to roll his unhealthy ego up Mount Psychotherapy, hoping that it will become healthy if ever he can get to the summit. But alas, there is always something else that prevents him from getting there. Yeah. Whereas the first law, I'm saying this allegorically, the first law of philosophical counseling, if there were one, might assert that sometimes there is nothing else. And indeed, when there is nothing else, then this is when the client no longer needs the philosophical counselor at that happy moment. And I would go even further and suggest to you that the first law of Buddhist ontology, elaborated very beautifully by Nagarjuna, is that there is nothing to begin with. That's a more complicated topic for another day. But this essay provoked a lot of interest, and I had a really interesting time both living it and writing it, and I hope it will interest you too. The second one in this part is one of the most important in the collection, actually, and it's thanks to our Korean friends. It's called Humanities Therapy, Restoring Well-Being in an Age of Culturally Induced Illness. So some of you will remember, Vaughn, I know you remember the conference in Chuncheon, Korea, organized by Young-Hee Ri, and a very, very beautiful conference in 2012, which attracted people from all over the world. And the Koreans had this fantastic insight, and coming as they do from South Korea, being very Americanized on the one hand, but on the other hand, being very Asian, they were able to look at the DSM and look at pharmacology and the sort of cabal that Rick alluded to early, this basic conspiracy to drug everybody and diagnose everybody in perpetuity. And the South Koreans had the temerity to stand up, these philosophers did, and say, this is cultural and economic imperialism and we don't need it. We have our own traditions. And so they very smartly, falling back on the Confucian notion of cooperation, social cooperation, they made a pact. They made an alliance with a number of other humanities therapists, Koreans who were practicing art therapy, music therapy, dance therapy, poetry therapy, calligraphy, martial arts, tea ceremony, a lot of beautiful indigenous Asian traditions. And they, allied with philosophical counseling, presented a broad front called humanities therapy, which activates the right brain and all of its wonderful creative and inventive capacities. So by doing this, they were also able to solve the problem of isolation that philosophical practitioners had experienced in the West, being critiqued sometimes very ociosely, actually, fatuously by people who knew nothing about us, but being critiqued nonetheless, and also being critiqued by philosophers who looked at us, particularly the analytic variety, and said, this is not philosophy, that stuff. But the Koreans did a great job of pulling together various resources from the humanities. And for this reason, humanities therapy is alive and well today in Korea. It's alive and well in China, where it migrated. And we are beginning to be able to introduce that here as well. But we're faced with Hamburger University. I stayed there. I took that picture. It's on the outskirts of Chicago. It's a McDonald's think tank. They have a very nice hotel. It's public. You can stay in the hotel. The food in this hotel is all healthy. It's disgustingly healthy. There's nothing unhealthy to be eaten on the campus of Hamburger University, where McDonald's executives are being trained to poison everybody else. But there's no McDonald's within 10 miles of this place. That should tell you a lot already. The picture on the bottom is a revelation, an epiphany. The figure on the left is a Buddhist mandala, which emanates from the artistic right brain. And the image on the left is a Mandelbrot set, the fundamental image, the fundamental elements of chaos theory, computer generated. It's also a fractal Buddha, contains infinite copies of itself at every level of magnification. And this is a way of saying that what we need to do with humanities therapy is balance the workings of the left brain and the right brain. The creative right brain with the diagnostic left brain need to be put better in balance, and that's what we can accomplish. The picture on the bottom left is a drawing, a silk screen from Soka University in Japan, built by Mr. Ikeda, and it is a silk screen of the School of Athens, the Raphael painting, yeah? And he basically commissioned this. It's a huge thing. It covers the entire auditorium stage. And it's a silkscreen of the School of Athens because for Mr. Ikeda, these Greek philosophers were also practitioners, and in the Mahayana Buddhist interpretation are on the Bodhisattva path. And so this was put up quite some decades before the meeting in Korea, but it also predicts, if you like, the meeting in Korea. All these Western philosophers on an Asian stage. It's quite prescient in its own right. Essay 11. In part 3, deals with a different topic, the biological roots of human conflict, a long-standing interest of mine, something I developed in the 80s and wrote extensively about. And here's only one little nugget, just a question for you, all right? A question for us all. Is the big brain adaptive? You know, as primates emerged and began to stand on our hind legs and develop this very big brain, the neocortex, and with it, the visual cortex, is it an adaptive feature or not, looking at on an evolutionary scale? Well, the good news is, you know, that we can do a lot of beautiful things with it. But the bad news is it may not be adaptive at all. If you graph, as I did, the longevity of species with increasingly big brains, what we notice is a shorter and shorter life expectancy of the species itself. Of course, our life expectancy is unknown, but our forebears are all gone. Maybe we hunted them to extinction. The great apes are now threatened, and the higher primates will soon be threatened by the overdevelopment and deforestation and the poisoning of natural resources that's ongoing without surcease. So it may be that we'll do ourselves in. All of this is explored in much greater length and breadth in the magnum opus on human conflict. Some of you may have read it. This book was also shadow banned by the publisher, Lexington Books. Rowman and Littlefield published it and immediately removed it from their philosophy lists and removed it from displays in philosophy conferences because they don't want you to read what's in it. It made them, in their own words, uncomfortable. I suggested to them that it was not a philosopher's job to make anybody comfortable. And if that were their aim in life, they ought to check into a palliative care unit. This also seemed to make them uncomfortable. The poetic justice and payback, it was almost immediate. In 2021, this was published in 2019. In 2021, this book was placed on the top 10 reading list of books to commemorate India's 75th year of independence. So you could ask yourself this question: which civilization has an interest in 75 more years of independence? That would be India. Which civilization has very little interest in 75 years more of independence? That would be ours. The last essay in part 3 is a skeptical view of sustainability. It begins as a joke because I had mentioned to an economist friend of mine, Daniel Schirlo from Sicily, that the only thing that appeared to be sustainable were conferences on sustainable development. And so because I jested with him and he agreed with me, he invited me to write this piece for a collection on sustainable development. I think nothing is sustainable independent of a time scale. You have to say on what scale things are sustainable, whether it's a proton or an amoeba or a human or a political system or a planet or a galaxy. It's all unfolding over a certain tract of time, and all things in the phenomenal world are going to be created and preserved and destroyed, and that we have from ancient Indian philosophy. I think they got it exactly right. So if you're going to talk about sustainable development, whether it's social or environmental or economic, it's a pipe dream unless you specify temporal context. So the moral of this story, my friends, is a very serious one. If you were to go into the wilderness and try to survive for a couple of weeks, as they do on faked reality TV shows, would you take with you as a source of fire? Would you take matches, waterproof matches, or a Zippo lighter? I think not, because they would not be sustainable in the wilderness for very long. Whereas what you would take with you is a flint or a fire bow, because these Stone Age methods and tools of making fire are immensely sustainable for us. The reason is because they don't develop. And so the moral of the story is that what is sustainable for humans is very often that which does not develop, whereas things that are constantly undergoing development and innovation are not long sustainable. That's a little food for thought. The takeaway from part 3 has to be this subsequent meeting with President Takeda and the publication of our Inner Philosopher dialogue. That's in several languages, and soon I hope will be in Turkish as well. But it's in these tongues thus far: English, Japanese, Chinese, Spanish, Italian. And it was a life-changing experience to dialogue with him in 2 ways. His philosophy of leadership is just the opposite of what we commonly encounter in the West, namely that people eventually reach positions of power by standing on a mountain of skulls. President Takeda's model is the inverse of this. The leader supports the pyramid from the bottom, uplifts everybody, and supports the entire weight of the pyramid by inverting it and supporting everything else. That's the true leadership model that comes from his humanistic Buddhism. The other thing that I learned from him is this great expansiveness. I had hoped in our dialogue to delve into details of Buddhist ontology and other deep matters. And President Takeda said, yeah, we could do that, but why don't we write a dialogue for non-philosophers and non-Buddhists? He has such an expansive and embracing mind. He always wants to reach out to people. And so I saw immediately the wisdom of doing this. And indeed, it has turned out to be very popular, precisely because we're writing about the inner philosopher that everyone possesses, but which may be dormant. And that is the common ground between Plato and Mahayana Buddhism. So a great, great life-changing experience, which has helped many people too. Okay, part 4, finally. Part 4, last but not least, the humanistic essays. And it may surprise some of you that I count Ayn Rand as a humanist, but she shares many features. I know Ayn Rand, zealots will bristle because they are objectivists, but objectivism shares many features with humanism, including methodological individualism and ethics derived from reason and not from a god, and many other features of secular humanism. Ayn Rand's masterpiece, Atlas Shrugged, was first published in 1957. It is also a highly prophetic work, those of you who know about it. And if you want to see the full measure of her prophetic abilities, go to Detroit, and you will see exactly what she describes in this book, unfortunately. But in the central portion of the book, there is a beautiful dialogue between the philosopher Hugh Axton, whom she created in the novel, and the protagonist Dagny Taggart. And Axton actually gives Dagny what we could today call philosophical counseling. It's really incredible, and I think it's well worth reading with that in mind. This one, I have to caution you, we're playing with fire. This was invited by Lydia Amir, whom we earlier referenced. Lydia is an amazing philosopher, an amazing practitioner, and a prolific author. So one of her recent collections is New Frontiers in Philosophical Practice. She invited me to write an essay, and it was, at the time, the centenary of the Cabaret Voltaire, one of my favorite places. It's in Zurich. I took that picture of it. And for those of you who do not know, the Cabaret Voltaire is the home of Dada. And Dadaism was a protest of performing artists and poets and philosophers and composers and all kinds of artists against the madness of World War I, the mechanized slaughter that massacred generations of young men, and the somnambulating, myopic politicians who fell into that trap and could not get out of it, but with more slaughter. And the Dadaists who opposed this were regarded as heretics, but they were right. Bertrand Russell was not a Dadaist, but he was also in prison for protesting the First World War. He was seen as unpatriotic. But Dada is brilliant, and Dada gave rise to the Beat generation. Dada gave rise to the hippies. Dada gave rise to jazz. Dada gave rise to the Marx Brothers in the US. Dada influenced a lot of things. with its artistic countercultural views. And the most famous piece of Dadaist art is also misunderstood, I think. It is Marcel Duchamp's defacement of Mona Lisa, the most important and beautiful painting perhaps in history, and Duchamp's defacement of her by virtue of painting a mustache and goatee on her is the most important defacement or parody of that work by Da Vinci. And the inscription LH au cul is in French a homonym for LH chaud au cul, which is, she has a hot derriere, so it's prurient. But it was not, in fact, a defacement of the art. It was much more subtle than that. And I think few people realize that Duchamp's deeper intention is not to mock great art, but to mock the great stupidity and conformity that allowed people prior to World War I to mingle in peace and gawk at the Mona Lisa in the Louvre. And if you go there, you won't be able to get close to it because at a given time, there are always 500 people in the room. It's the only painting in the room. Everybody wants to see it up close. And so you had that in peacetime contrasted with the First World War, when they were slaughtering each other in the trenches in order to, I guess, seize her as a spoil of war. And I think this is the meaning of his defacement. He's defacing the blind politics that led to that slaughter. Well, we borrowed a leaf from the Dadaists book, and APA could be seen as Dadaist in this spirit. We stamped our logo on on another great work of the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, and no one's complained too much. But it gets a little more trenchant, and Rick began to reflect on this when we get to this essay 14. Again, we'll see Heroes of the Revolution. Rick understood what this was because it's our former chancellor, Matt Goldstein, who had actually done a lot of things to shut down initiatives that weren't with the program at CUNY. And really, CUNY is a People's Democratic University. As many of you may know, our university system has been transformed into People's Democratic Universities. And if you think I'm over exaggerating by photoshopping him into this pantheon of Marxist gods, I want you to rest assured, at a luncheon in New York City, around the time that I was photoshopping him into this poster, I was invited to a World Economic Forum luncheon with Mario Giuliani at the time. This goes back a while. Then Governor Pataki was there and some other high rollers along with Wall Street people. It was a typical World Economic Forum luncheon. And I was buttonholed by a guy. We had some drinks before lunch. And this guy named Dan Golden approached me and cornered me and said, I have a good mind to phone your chancellor, this Goldstein guy, phone your chancellor and read him the Riot Act. And I said, Dan, don't point the finger at me. I'll help you connect the call. Maybe he'll talk to you. He doesn't talk to faculty. And Dan had NASA on his name tag. And I said, well, what do you do at NASA? And he said, I run it. So this was Dan Golden, a former alumnus of City College, not one of our Nobel laureates, but an alumnus who ran NASA at the time. And Dan was furious, and many City College alumni were equally furious at the way Goldstein was running City College into the ground. And they were forever grateful to City College for the education they got there, but they did not like the turn it had taken. So this is, I was not alone in having this view. In any case, if you voted for Hillary Clinton, you should avert your gaze. You should not look at the next slide because you may not like it. But I predicted that Trump would win the 2016 election. And it was very clear to me and to others, I guess, that Hillary had this unwholesome craving for her precious, being, in this case, the White House. She really wanted the precious. And when people want their precious, they will go to unholy lengths to obtain it. It's the Lord of the Rings story all over again. People cannot really be trusted with power. I guess hobbits can on a good day, but most of us can't. So the ring is not for us. And that's just another portrayal which actually rang true come election time. But we didn't have the end of her with that. Let's go to a happier note. Humanistic Essays 15. Well, we had a wonderful conference in Mexico City run by David Sumiaker, and this brought to fruition this idea of awakening the inner philosopher. And this is another way to demarcate those of you who are, wondering still what's the difference between philosophical counseling and psychotherapy. Well, one of the differences, or one of the ways of attempting to illustrate that, is to suggest that philosophical counselors are attempting to awaken the inner philosopher in our clients. Once again, this is the maieutic process. It's a humanistic process. We believe that there is an inner philosopher who, once awakened and activated, can actually allow the person to become their own philosopher, their own guide, and not require further counseling. Thus, it's not an endless Sisyphean process. So we want to awaken the inner philosopher in our clients. It is manifestly not the case that most psychiatrists have the mission of awakening the inner psychiatrist in their patients. No, their patients are seriously ill and have some other issue that needs to be dealt with medically. And it's similarly, but differently, not the case that most psychotherapists are trying to awaken the inner psychotherapist in their clients. They're also trying to heal some affective disorder, one kind or another. We're not doing that. And if we can awaken the inner philosopher in our clients, then for our purposes, they are well, and they can in turn do good and live well. So I think that is a salient difference between what we do, contrasted with psychiatry and psychology. Okay. Wonderful event. As you can see, these ICPPs get bigger and more interesting and more diverse as we progress. And finally, and this was the last event before the pandemic. It took place in August of 2019. It was the ICPP, not an ICPP, but an international conference on humanities therapy and techno society, convened by this person on the left in the blue shirt. That's Professor Tiankun Pan, who's China's leading pioneer. Yoongi Ri, a couple of people next to him, is Korea's leading pioneer, and also Bernard Lee, professor and former president of a university in Taipei that's involved in philosophical counseling. We all convened with a number of Chinese and Korean and other practitioners from Asia and the West to discuss the problem of detriments of techno society. To be brief, you all know that there are detrimental effects now that psychologists and sociologists and all kinds of people are beginning to uncover from the overuse and abuse of virtual media, particularly young children are being damaged by Facebook and other of these platforms. And this is all now starting to come to light. We also realized it. And just let me give you one quick insight before I stop. The quick insight is a contrast between two families. This family, painted in the 1630s, and it's called Family Making Music. Now, look at them. They're a family and they are together making music. They are therefore active producers of culture. If you wanted music in the 1630s, you had to make it or pay someone to make it. But if you were making music, you were actively producing culture. This is a beautiful thing. I should not have to convince you that it strengthens familial bonds and also engages large muscle groups, and people are experiencing togetherness and doing something very beautiful. Contrast that with the 21st century, where families are now divided and conquered by these technology platforms. They have been turned into passive consumers of culture, no longer active producers. They are passive consumers. Each one's consciousness has been hijacked by some app, and they are therefore dissociated. And particularly with young people, it's causing a lot of problems. All right, and more of them will come to light as we continue. So that's the Cook's tour of the volume. We did not stop there. Little did we suspect in August of 2019 that there was something very bad brewing in Wuhan. But it came to pass that the world was locked down shortly thereafter. We did not stop. Solitude is not a punishment for philosophers. And we produced in 2020 the very first double issue of APA's journal, which was devoted to how philosophy can help during a global pandemic. And contributors to that include some people who are here today: Vana, Rick, Patricia, if she's able to listen in from her train in Italy. I know she's riding a train. Shanti's here and contributed to it, and so did others who may or may not be in the room. But we can help during a pandemic too. If you're interested in this volume, all back issues are obtainable from our website. So the work goes on. And I want to thank you all for this opportunity to present this book. I'm going to stop the share here and open the chat room and ask if anyone has any questions or comments. We have wonderful friends in the room and some very astute philosophers. So I will invite any questions or comments that you wish to make.